I'm going to continue with the exploration of deep order by looking at time and space a little more deeply. Now, to summarize what we've covered so far, we began with this notion of similar patterns that occur from the micro through to the macro, and these patterns are patterns of progress that all go through the same stage, which I call the physical, vital, mental. So there's a progression through these stages, and the fact that it happens from the micro to the macro means that this is a fractal pattern, and it's summarized by the growth of a seed into a flower, where we have the seed being identical with the physical phase, the stalk with the vital, and the flower with the mental. So this gives us a first level of deep order, which is a motion through time. Now, when we step back and look at the similar pattern that occurs in time regardless of area, then we're struck by some other properties of the system that we live in. First of all, this pattern occurs regardless of region, of area, of industry, of organization. And so there's a kind of an omnipresence whereby this pattern occurs within the system. And further, when we think about the fact that there are incredible obstacles from moving from one phase to the next, so crossing over from one level of progress to another means there's a lot of hurdles that need to be overcome. We're struck by this property of omnipotence that the system possesses. And a third property that emerges is that of omniscience, because always the right organization or the right individual or the right circumstances selected by which the progress can happen. So there's a kind of an all-knowingness to the system. And then there's a property of omnicaring, in that it's possible that the entire system could have remained at one level and there could have been no progress, but the fact that that doesn't happen and that everything is moving towards a higher degree of possibility means that there's some kind of deep compassion or love in the system. So what we have is these four properties that define some kind of a fullness that exists at every point in the system. So this is a second level of deep order that gives us insight into space, how space is organized. Now, when we map time against space, we come up with a wedge of causality under some kind of time-space boundary, x. And in this time-space wedge of causality, what we're saying is that the systems and the organizations that we run, that we're part of, are thinking about how these operate can be enhanced by considering these deeper levels of order of time and space and the kind of causality that exists within this wedge. So the last time I had shared some explorations, I had gone through 12 properties that emerge from this wedge of causality, and very simply, these were fullness, identity, uniqueness, the first three properties that give us insight into the nature, into the static nature of each point in the system. Then we had some properties of emergence, flowering, and direction, which gives us insight into the dynamic nature of each point in the system. And then we had another set of properties, alternative narrative, intersection, and the fractal reality, that gives us insight into the nature of development within a wedge of causality. And then we had another set of properties, remembering, linking, and relating, that gives us insight into how we can relate to the deeper system we're a part of. So there are 12 properties that emerged, and now with this as the background, I want to look at the nature of time and space a little more deeply. So as we've said, through time, through any passage of time, within any wedge of causality, there's a certain progression that happens that displays this pattern of the flower. And I'd go further and say that when we think about time on a more macro level, more micro level, then we're going to see these similar displays of the flower on smaller and smaller scale. And when we think about time at a macro level, then this entire wedge of causality could itself be a part of a much larger pattern, also displaying the flowers. So we have, again, a fractal reality to time, where time displays motion or movement through these phases of a flower, regardless of the scale at which we consider time. Now, another thing I would say about time, so we have, just summarizing, if we think about time itself, there's a fractal division of time, where we see movement of or through a flower that occurs regardless of scale of time. And then secondly, as we consider a single journey through a flower, we'll see that there's several stages. So there's a stage in which we're going through the seed phase, there's a transition phase from the seed to the stalk, there's a stage where we go through the stalk, a transition phase, and then a stage where we go through a flower. So there are at least 5 different kinds of time, if you will. And I would hypothesize that the flow of time, so the way that we experience time and the way that time works, is different in each of these phases, if you will. So in the nature of exploration, it is perhaps fair to say that time might be of a certain type as it goes through the seed, and it might be perhaps developing a possibility as it goes through that seed phase. But when we cross from the seed to the stalk, then time is of a very different nature and perhaps is much more integrative. And that leads us into the discussion of what is the nature of space. So we had started off with the notion that there is a fullness in any point of space, and this fullness has as its characteristics omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnicaring. These are big words. So if we break these down, for example, like omnipresence, we can say that there are many parameters that define that. And for instance, these may be things like service, perfection, detailed movement, perseverance, and so on. When we think about omniscience, some of the parameters that further define that may be wisdom, knowledge, a large laying down of the laws that characterize things, and so on. When we think about omnipotence, some of the parameters that define that might be power, courage, sense of adventure, justice, and so on. And when we think about omnicaring, the kinds of things that characterize that may be love, compassion, harmony, mutuality, sense of relationship, and so on. So there's many things that are contained within these 4 broad categories, And what I'd hypothesize is that any instance of space is really an emphasis on some aspect of this fourfold fullness while keeping the other aspects also present. So for instance, if we think about space A, then that might be, omnipresence might be the driving or the key characteristic there and a sense of service. If we think about space B, then the key emphasis there may be omnipresence, but there may be an emphasis on perfection, and everything else is also present. If we think about point C, then the key emphasis in that interpretation of fullness might be a sense of omnicaring, with love being the key thing, and so on and so forth. So space itself has an infinite variety, which is characterized by, or is ordered by this fourfold order, if you will. And so when we think about a passage through time, where we're crossing from one boundary to the next, what I would hypothesize is that during that brief passage of time, there's a much larger integration of different possibilities in space to create a new foundation possibility that then becomes the driving factor as, say, time flows through the next stage in this flower journey. So, summarizing, we have passage through time, which can vary depending if it's flowing from seed or seed to stalk or through stalk. And the hypothesis is that during transition phases, there's an integration of many different possibilities in space, and when we emerge from that integration, we come up with a new foundation that creates, if you will, the basis of the journey of the next stage in this flower. And to bring this point home, in today's environment, we might be going through something very much like that. If we think about how the nature of organization is changing as a result of the different kinds of developments in the internet space, and there's a huge rapidity and there's a huge influx of funds and different development that are taking place right now, in which many different things that we cannot even possibly get our heads around are being integrated together. For example, we have social interaction, we have ubiquitous mobility, we have a whole different mindset that is orienting how a large section of society thinks about technology, especially the millennials and so on. And so there's a huge compression of different possibilities, and this is happening rapidly, and as a result of this, some new foundation would be created, which would then define the rest of this journey through the flower that we're going through in this instance of space and time. I'll end there for now.